Good afternoon, and welcome everyone to Let's Talk Climate. I'm Jennifer Roberts, your host for today. It is an extraordinary time for our country and our planet. And I want to take a minute to acknowledge the pain and the trauma that so many are experiencing, whether it is illness from COVID, loss of a loved one, loss of a job, the burden of years of racial injustice, displacement from climate impacts. The list goes on and on. Our hearts are heavy, but thank you for joining us in the midst of these crises. Our guest today will be addressing this timely and important topic of racial and climate justice, and will leave us with ideas for some positive actions for our communities. Before we jump into our conversation, I want to share some brief housekeeping items. The session is being recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing on ecoAmerica's YouTube channel shortly after the broadcast. Please engage with us online using the hashtag Let's Talk Climate throughout our discussion and in the days to come. Please also use the chat function to ask questions throughout the webcast. You can send your questions to us by choosing all panelists from the drop box. And ecoAmerica staff are standing by to answer any technical questions and to help facilitate questions and answers that will come later in this webcast. Today, we are talking about communities, climate, equity, and policy. Please join me in welcoming our guests. Sarita Turner is the newly promoted Vice President for U.S. Programs with the Institute for Sustainable Communities, and she is a nationally recognized trainer and speaker on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Domingo Garcia is a lawyer, a former Texas state representative, and is currently the national president of the League of United Latin American Citizens, also called LULAC. Thank you both for being here. We are experiencing multiple concurrent crises, and these crises are affecting people deeply, individually and collectively, and most often inequitably. Our conversation today is going to address climate justice, which we know is intrinsically linked to racial justice. In fact, many have called the pollution that communities of color have been subjected to over the decades a form of environmental violence, enabled by structural, centuries-old racism in America. The health impacts of this pollution lead to higher incidences of chronic illness, which contributes to a cycle of sickness, decreased earnings, poverty, and more. So let's get started with our conversation today. Sarita, I want to start with you because I know that you worked for a time in Minneapolis. And of course, Minneapolis has been at the center of exposing racial injustice because it is where the murder of George Floyd took place, the murder that has led to an uprising for racial justice that has really spread worldwide. I'd love to hear your thoughts about how is the current uprising for racial justice impacting the work that you do every day with communities of color around the country who are pursuing climate action and looking for equitable climate solutions?
Well, Jennifer, that's a really great question. But first of all, I just want to thank ecoAmerica and you in particular for having me as a guest today. I really appreciate that we're having these conversations and the opportunity to weigh in on them. You are right. I've worked in Minneapolis for quite a long time because I'm actually from Minneapolis and I lived there my entire life until I moved to Oakland, California about 11 years ago. And I'm actually in Minneapolis now. It was just a time to return home and to be close to family and friends and to love and support each other. So I think, you know, one of the things that I really want to emphasize is the emotional struggle that this moment has emphasized, but it's not new. these kinds of dastardly, harmful, challenging situations have been going on for a long time. And, you know, just growing up here, there was a young man that was shot in the back by police in you know, I think it was the early 90s, Tysel Nelson, and we can't forget about him. And then Jamar Clark recently, and Philando Castile. And so around our country, and actually this country has been rooted in violence against Black people, founded in violence against Black people, and using them as a source of capital. So I think it's really important for all of us to understand, while we're seeing these vivid images of a murder of an unarmed Black man who was suspected of stealing $20, and, you know, which is totally ridiculous in and of itself, that these challenges are not new, and that we are living in a culture of white supremacy. And we also are living in a culture that has institutionalized, while all of us know, like, these things are wrong, they're not okay, it's institutionalized in all of our systems and practices. And we've seen a lot of that in the climate sector itself, which is just coming around to recognizing that Black and brown people are the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, that the historic racism of this country has situated us to be the most vulnerable by through discriminatory land use practices, the denial of access to opportunity and resources, and all of the different ways that legal discrimination, legal racism, now, even though it's illegal, still shows up, and it's blaring and crying out at us in the form of racial disparities across not just the criminal unjust system, which is what I call it, but in every category of quality of life across every indicator of quality of life category. So I think that, you know, one of the things that the communities that we work with at ISC have had to do, and the community leaders that I'm familiar with have had to do, they've had to really quickly think about how to shift resources. They need to help bail people out of jail, provide for legal assistance for folks who were out protesting and have been experiencing further abuse at the hands of the police, and sometimes arrested, and having charges that are as trumped up as you know, we're going to kill a guy over suspecting that he used a counterfeit $20 bill. So a lot of emphasis now, there already was, but a lot of emphasis on voter outreach. And I know that that's part of what you want to talk about later, voter outreach and education, and really taking time ourselves to join protests, right? Taking time away from the daily grind, which was already overwhelming and underfunded, to join in this moment. So I'll stop there. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you, Sarita. It has been heartening to see the unifying members of the marches. I've seen a lot of environmental groups joining right in, and I've seen signs in Spanish, you know, immigrant Latino groups, and it's been wonderful to see people bringing, you know, coming together and bringing that issue to the fore. And Domingo, you know, speaking of signs in Spanish in our Latino community, I want to bring you into the conversation. Now that you've been able to find your right side up, lovely portrait. I know that we're all, you know, we're all in limbo these days with COVID and trying to use technology. And so we're really pleased to see you join us, and thank you for getting your picture straight up. I want to ask you, Domingo, your organization issued a statement that said, "Our Black community is hurting. LULAC affirms that we rise to join in steadfast solidarity with the people across our country demanding fundamental reforms." That's terrific to see that unity. And I want to ask you about, you know, in terms of sustainability and health issues, I've heard you speak a great deal about Latino farmers who've been challenged, and of course the meat packing workers who've been challenged by COVID and by our climate and climate changes. Can you tell us what climate justice looks like for these farmers and for the Latino community in general?
Sure. Thank you for having me. And I will like to say, just to piggyback on our first speaker, Sarita's comments, I was at George Floyd's funeral on Tuesday in Houston, Texas. And it was very emotional setting, and I was invited to represent LULAC there. And historically, my mother comes from a small town called Porvenir, Texas, which in 1919, all the men, and we're talking about men ages 12 to 81, Mexican-American U.S. citizens, were picked up by the Texas Rangers. Their hands were tied behind their back, and they were executed, massacred. No Ranger was ever charged, arrested, or convicted. And now that was 1919, and that was cold-blooded murder. There was no video cameras back then. And we've seen that same trajectory that we've seen with African Americans in the Latino communities throughout the United States also. So brown and black men have traditionally been disproportionately arrested, harassed, and killed by police departments across the country. So that's why we rise in solidarity with the African American community and Black Lives Matter. In terms of climate change and what's happening, what we found out is 4 out of every 5 Latino workers are considered essential. That means the farm workers who are picking the crops in the field that wind up becoming your broccoli and your lettuce that goes to the grocery store. The meats are the meatpacking plants. I was in Greenlee, Colorado at a JBS plant where 8 workers died in the last month. Over 400 and something were tested positive. And they work under the terriblest conditions. If you remember reading The Jungle, Upton Sinclair's story about 19th century meatpacking plants in Chicago, they have not changed that much. In trying to get safety requirements for them to make sure that they are working in a safe environment, and if not, getting government to come in and put pressure on them has been difficult. To the farmers and the ranchers who have seen their livelihoods to a large extent impacted with droughts through climate change that are impacting their ability to maintain their cattle stock, and then to all the people that are working in the even the cannabis industry gets impacted by this. People don't think about that, but cannabis is now legal in Colorado and California. So our farmers have been impacted by the droughts, the forest fires, the Houston, where I have a house at. Hurricane Harvey dropped 50 inches of rain and flooded the entire city for weeks. So we know that climate change is real, and it unfortunately is disproportionately impacting the minority communities. If we look at, I'm in Dallas, Texas today, 60% of all the COVID-19 cases are Latinos, even though Latinos are only 43% of Dallas County. And we're seeing that nationally in Bronx, in New York. The majority of the deaths have been Latino deaths in New York City. Again, underreported, and we think a lot of that is the inequities we've seen in our system, the healthcare, the educational system, and the inequities in income have disproportionately impacted African American Latino families throughout the United States.
Absolutely, and you have some really specific examples which really tell a story. I wonder, and Domingo, I'm going to continue with you, so you can answer as well. I know that you've been a local and a state official, elected official, and our research at ecoAmerica tells us that Americans right now do not trust Congress very much. But the trust goes up when you look at what local officials can do. Their local mayors and state representatives. And so I'm wondering, do you see in this current crisis an attitude toward, is there any attitude change in where people are turning for support for those reforms? Are they still trusting local officials? Are they looking for more of that community collaboration? Or are they going to Congress? Kind of what do you see? I'll start with you, Domingo, and then I'll ask Sarita.
I think if you want change on climate, if you want serious police reforms, it has to start from the grassroots up. And that means your school boards, your city councils, your county governments, because that's where you can have a direct impact. So for example, when the city council of Minneapolis says we're going to dismantle and defund our police department and reimagine what policing can do, that was done by them. And at the same time, you're looking at Congress trying to figure out just to ban chokeholds, and the president saying, I'm not going to do anything. I'm not even going to take down Confederate monuments. I mean, there's sort of a disconnect between the Washington bubble and what's happening at the grassroots, whether in Minneapolis, in Houston. When I was at the funeral, George Floyd, the mayor of Houston, Sylvester Turner, who was African American, said, I'm going to issue an executive order banning checos. I'm going to issue an executive order to only use lethal force as a last resort in any situation. And he gave about 5 or 7 executive orders in one day. That's something that can be done at a local level that unfortunately with the gridlock in Washington, that basically appears to be able to do nothing about either climate change, COVID-19, or serious police reform and improving racial relations in America.
I'm glad to hear you mention Mayor Sylvester Turner because he's a great mayor. And I remember meeting him when Charlotte played in the Super Bowl because Houston got the Super Bowl after we had it. He's a great person. Sarita, I wonder if your perspective on people turning to local government for solutions.
Yeah, I just want to, appreciate Domingo for bringing Houston into this conversation. My daughter actually lives in Houston. She works for an environmental justice organization, and she really appreciates Mayor Turner as I do as well. We also at ISC are working on, and Jennifer said that we would really want to probably continue to connect after this webcast.
Okay.
And we're working on a 9-county equitable recovery endeavor in a 9-county Upper Texas Gulf Coast area. So I definitely want to circle back with you on that. And
by the way, I'm a proud Thurgood graduate of Thurgood Marshall School of Law in Houston too.
Oh my gosh, TSU is one of our local lead partners for the initiative, and we're planning an event whenever we can get together again in person in the Thurgood Marshall School of Law. So we definitely, something is happening here. But I think just to really hone in on Jennifer's question, yesterday we had a leadership team meeting with our partners there in the Upper Texas Regional Gulf Coast. And really what we gelled around was really that folks have to be educated. We have to educate the electorate, and that we haven't done a good job of that, even as progressive community, progressive partners. We've kind of looked past the folks who are really on the fringes and suffering the most in terms of disenfranchisement, and really educating them, especially about the down ballot importance of voting, what the positions of judges and county judges and commissioners, and why it is critically important to understand who to vote for in those situations as well, depending on what your values are and what kind of policies you want to see in place. But we also have seen some really wonderful things happen at the national level. And I think that we saw some movement. We elected the first Black president of the United States of America, 2 terms. It was a ground up, as Domingo has indicated, it was a ground up approach that resulted that. And then we saw the backlash of that happen. And then we also saw 2 years ago in the national election, the most diverse House of Representatives voted into office that we've ever had in the United States of America. And so I think that what I hear from the communities I work with and live in is that we want candidates to vote for. We will vote. We will get out and we will make it happen. But we have to have people to invest our vote in that we believe in. And when we do have those great candidates, we do see the turnout happen. And I think that we're also at a wonderful moment, as painful it is in terms of recognizing the intersection between the kinds of impacts we're seeing disproportionately of the pandemic on people of color, the uprising around police brutality and the kinds of conditions that people have had to live in and exist in for decades and decades, and tying those with the environmental and climate issues of today that folks are, right, that Harvey flood, that flood has impacted people of color much more. They have not been able to recover. And if they do recover at all, they will recover less better off economically than their white counterparts. And we've seen this time and time again. The data shows us this. And I think that now we have communities that are being educated and organizing, and they're seeing the convergence of these issues. And they are understanding, as well as the rest of the nation is starting to understand, that racism is the #1 enemy that we need to fight here. It's racism that has poisoned all these institutional practices and these other systems, and even our climate community, in terms of really getting to real change and making people's lives better, no matter what race you are or where you live.
There are so many connections, Sarita. You're absolutely correct. And the realization is coming that climate violence and racial violence are intertwined. There's so many connections that we could talk about. But I want to go back just for a minute to voting, because we had a great question come in from Aaron, who's listening online, about the challenge of getting information, correct information on candidates. And when you work with Black and brown communities, sometimes there are cultural and language barriers. There are Wi-Fi and internet, access barriers. So can you talk a little bit about the climate issue and reaching voters and educating them, some of the things that you're dealing with?
I'm saying that especially young Latino and actually all young people, and I think it's cross ethnic lines that they know climate change is real. They understand the impact it's having on the future of America and the future of themselves. Here, I've seen it, like going back to Houston, the environmental racism, the refineries where all that oil goes to are predominantly in Black and brown neighborhoods. And by the way, that happens across America. And then those pollutants go up into the air, create what we're seeing now in terms of global warming, impacting our climates everywhere. And so we see it firsthand from the beginning, and then the after effects afterwards. And I think that's motivating many voters to get involved. Are you for a new Green Deal or something like that changes things, that AOC is pushing, as well as other progressive Democrats? Or do you want to see something that impacts on a very personal level, what you eat, how you eat, what do we use plastic or not? Do we use recyclable materials? And I think young people are engaged, and they're looking at candidates that are supporting those type of policies, whether it's banning plastic bags at grocery stores, or whether it's dealing with putting solar and wind and energy power in the local municipalities and providing incentives for people to put solar panels in their homes. Those are things that I think young voters are looking for and asking candidates whether they're running for city council, county commissioner, or statewide.
And Sarita? Yep.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really at the heart of the work that we're doing with what we call our community-led resilience work at the Institute for Sustainable Communities. We believe, and the communities that we work with know, that our communities have not been educated about how climate actually impacts the things that are most important to them in their communities. So the connection hasn't been made because the climate sector, the mainstream climate sector, made the conversation about ice glaciers and polar bears and turtles with straws in their nose, and not about the people who live in the communities who are suffering the impacts of climate change every single day. And so if I am a mother I'm a family with 3 kids, and we're raising these kids, and we have mold in our house because it floods when it rains hard, because our infrastructure is insufficient to do the runoff that it's supposed to do and that it does in more affluent communities. I have not now connected in my mind the frequency of the rains, the torrential impact of the rains, with the fact that I have mold in my house. And I certainly haven't connected it with the fact that the city needs to upgrade, or the county, whoever's responsible, needs to upgrade the infrastructure, and that I'm actually paying tax dollars for that to happen. But those resources are not being shifted to where the greatest needs are. They're being shifted to where the folks have the most money and the most lobbying power and can contribute the most to campaigns. So we believe that the number one thing that people need is education. They need to understand how climate actually impacts their everyday lives. And then they need to know how to situate themselves in order to change it. And that we have to develop materials in layman's terms to help make these connections for folks. And we have to also then help them organize and understand, you know, every local jurisdiction operates differently. The resources are found in different places. So the question about the local context is really a great one, because we need the capacity to actually document for each jurisdiction what not only the process is to get policies changed and to influence the capital budget and the city budgets, but we need also to be able to document some facts about each of the candidates and each of those down ballot positions, and make that information available to people so that when they do go vote, they are making an educated vote, and that when they do decide to get involved in their community or they get a seat at a table, then they actually can be in a conversation with the information and tools that they need to be effective.
One of the things, and this is such a great conversation about public engagement, and Sarita, you are singing our song about the storytelling and about, we don't know polar bears, but we know people with mold in their homes, and we know kids with asthma who are carrying their asthma sprays with them to school. And we see these impacts every day, and that's exactly how you make it real for people so that they look at climate as a voting issue.
Yes.
But I wanted to take another question from our listeners regarding organizations that you work with in collaboration that are helping with the same sort of advocacy. What are some red flags that you see as a person of color when you're looking to see that a collaborator is diverse and inclusive in a fundamental way? What are red flags that you see that indicate they may not quite be there?
I look for diversity on their board. Do they have people of color on their board? Do they invest in Latino and African American communities? What are they doing there? For example, we're subject to a lot of voter suppression. For example, in Dodge City, Kansas, just 2 years ago, the Secretary of State, who was a right-wing Republican, was running for governor, moved, for those of you who don't know, Dodge City is a majority Latino population of 63%. Meatpacking plants are there. And they moved the polling places outside of Dodge City. So literally you had to get out of Dodge if you were a voter, primarily a minority voter, to get out. And we were able to get the ACLU to represent an 18-year-old high school senior, Alejandro Lopez, to pursue Kansas to allow a polling place in their town, okay? And we were successful, but it was after the election. However, they elected the first Democratic governor in Kansas in I don't know how many years. So we were successful in getting Latino out. But we see those battles and all over the country as we're facing voter suppression as the numbers continue to grow. And so we're looking with allies and partners that have, would be good faith partners and allies of ours.
Terrific. Sarita, when you give your answer about what you look for as red flag, I'd love to hear your explanation, which I learned when I was in a conference with you, about the word disadvantaged versus disinvested, and how important that is in looking at communities of color.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And thank you for remembering that part of our conversation. So, some of the things that are red flags are not, I'm going to say, they're not surprises. They're tokenism, patronizing dialogue, um, which actually leads to the piece about, do people still comfortable? Right? Are they able to go in a room and be comfortable, or do they feel nervous and uptight? And if they do, what is that about? What is going on inside of you that may be implicit or explicit, that you don't feel comfortable around communities, around people of color, around, do they go into the community to do their work, and do they try to develop, and have they developed meaningful relationships, or do they expect everybody to come to the ivory tower and meet with them? And do they rely on the people of color that they know to be the link to the relationships, rather than them developing genuine relationships of their own, which actually then takes some, like, you might have to take a few lumps to develop genuine relationships, because you are going into a new territory. You're going into a place of if you're a white person and you've been living in whiteness your entire life, and then you wake up to the fact that whiteness is not helpful, it's harmful, and you want to change it, then it takes time to change. You're not going to change overnight. And so are you willing to go through that discomfort, or are you in a place where you're going to go to your default is fragility, is finding excuses, or becoming upset or flustered, or that kind of thing, and then blaming the communities, the people that you are supposed to be working on behalf of. You are supposed to be serving them for your discomfort, or for the progress not being made. So part of what I'm talking about does get to this piece about language that Jennifer just brought up. So at ISC, we've developed a list of no words. Like, we've developed a list of words that are not affirming, that are blaming. So the word disadvantaged really does say there's something wrong with the community. The community is disadvantaged. This person is disadvantaged, when in fact, they have been unfairly divested of the resources that are rightfully theirs. The resources rightfully belong to the communities. I had a chance to have a conversation with a colleague really early on when I took my job at ISC, which has only been about 24 months ago now. And we were talking about racial equity, because we believe in the US context, equity, the underlying factor across any indicator of quality of life or success is race. Race is where you see the disparity search show up. But there's other places you see disparities show up, but most often it's race, no matter what gender you are, no matter your sexual orientation, no matter your physical ability. If you are Black or brown, you are doing worse than if you are white. And so when I was in this dialogue with this colleague, and she said, well, how is it fair for a person of color to come and take a job from a white person? And so I said to her, I said, see, this is the challenge. It's not that person's job. It's the job of the job belongs to the organization. This job I'm in doesn't belong to me. It belongs to ISC. Because when I'm in it no longer, whether I decide or they decide, someone else will be in it, and they won't be in my job. They will be in the job at ISC. And so I said, the challenge is for you to think about why you see it that way. White people have been told that they own everything, and that if people of color want something, we're taking something away from you. That is not the case. All of it belongs to all of us, just unfairly distributed. So we like to talk about fairness and things that have been done to communities, rather than you're disadvantaged because you are doing less well than someone else. You're not disadvantaged because you're doing less well. You've had an unfair, you haven't had the opportunities to do as well. So I'll leave that there, Jennifer, but I hope I got to what you wanted me to get to in that point.
Absolutely. Language is so important. And I really appreciate the work that you're doing in so many communities. And you mentioned something that brought up another interest by one of our listeners. And this is Lisa from Maryland, who, because you talked about property. And I think, of course, the original property was Native American property. And we have a history of having taken all that, and there are even Native American techniques at climate resilience that we haven't listened to hard enough. And so the question from Lisa is, how can we better support and protect Native Americans in this climate conversation? So love to hear from both of you. Domingo.
Well, my mother is full-blooded Native American Apache. So going to have a kind of an insight on that. And Native Americans, whether it's the Apache Nation or Native tribes throughout the United States, have a love for Mother Earth and nature and protecting nature. And they are concerned when waters are polluted in rivers that impact their lands. They are concerned and have been fighting the effects of climate change at different levels, and are important that they be brought into the conversation. They do have some legitimate points of view. I still remember, if y'all are old enough, that don't pollute our water. There's a Native American with a tear coming down his face. But that's really reflective of what we've talked about. And instead of just exploiting the land, tearing it up, Oklahoma, where a lot of the Native American nations were removed during the Trail of Tears, the Choctaw Nation, Cherokees, and so on, they've been having earthquakes, and the earthquakes are man-made through the fracking and the drilling that's been done in the areas there in Oklahoma and Texas, and that's impacting the quality of life. When you have earthquakes, some of them up to 5.0, that could impact schools and so on. So that's a very legitimate and in strong voice that needs to be heard.
Yeah, I even heard there's an issue with getting voting information to people on reservations, because the whole address system and the way the Postal Service works is very different. I mean, there's so many cultural issues. Sarita, I don't know if you wanted to add to that, or.
Yeah, just a little bit. So the NFL came out and said, we should have not discounted and disrespected our Black players, right? When they were involved in peaceful protests about this very issue of the uprising. And so I think that the Black community, I think all communities need to demand that the NFL and other sports franchises just do basic things like stop disrespecting Native Americans by using depictions of them that they say are insulting. When people tell you that you are harming them, you're harming them, and stop. And so I think there is just, as with other people of color, but I think there is something historical also about the need to depict Native Americans in a manner that is disrespectful to them. We also treat them like they are invisible. So much of our data does not even, because the sample size, we get into all these different ways that Native Americans are invisible in this country, right? We are not counting them in the data, even when we're talking about aggregations, data aggregations of people of color. Oftentimes, Native Americans are not included in those data aggregations. And so, and to Domingo's point, and I think it gets back to these sports, what are they called? The
Franchises?
well, no, their little icon, their
Logos?
Yeah, they're
Oh,
whatever. Like,
watching the Redskins.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
That we actually, when they talk about their relationship with land, Native Americans have the most sacred relationship with land of any community that I know of, certainly in this country. They understand the relationship between our ability to live, actually, not just thrive, but actually have life, and the land. And we are disrespecting them in so many different ways in terms of their beliefs with relationship to the land, their own spiritual beliefs. We say in this country that this religious discrimination is a crime, yet you hear so much about their sacred burial grounds being disrupted by development. And so I just think, we're just in an entire disregard and disrespect for the Native community. And I really want to call to action our other Black and Brown communities that we really need to rally around our Native brothers and sisters as well, and be in unity around these issues.
No, that was a great question.
If I could just add real quick, just because I know I believe you're in Minnesota. Is that correct?
I don't live here, but I'm here visiting because this is where I'm from. So yeah,
Okay. Well, for
I'm
example,
right now.
People always talk about lynchings of African Americans in the South and of Mexican Americans in the Southwest. The largest lynching ever was done of Sioux warriors there in Minnesota in 1863, where I believe 38 men were hung. The largest lynching in American history. But again, something that's not taught in American history. So Native Americans know and have felt the impact of violence. And now today, whether it's the Sioux Nations in North or South Dakota, they're feeling they are disproportionately being killed also in various encounters with the police. So I agree that their voices should be heard.
No, absolutely. And even here in North Carolina, we have a fight over a natural gas pipeline that's going to go through Native American burial grounds. And again, the disregard. It's interesting to talk about language. When you hear people say, I see you, like how important it is to say, I see you. Not only do I hear you, but I see you as a person who is worthy of dignity and respect like anybody else in this country. So important. I want to turn to some positive things. We want to hear some places where there is great work going on, where there is resilience and climate solutions that are inclusive, that are working with Native communities and communities of color, and building on their solutions that they bring forward, including those voices. So I would love to hear each of you, and I know that Sarita, you work with communities all across the country, and I know, Domingo, you've done quite a bit of work as well with Latinos all across the country and other communities. Give us some good examples of people who are getting it right in an inclusive way and helping build a stronger climate and mitigating the pollution that we're seeing. So I'll start with Domingo.
Well, I'll just give you an example. Taos, New Mexico, which has a large Native American population, large Latino population, where they are building what are called earth ships from recycled tires and cans, and putting adobe, traditional Native American, Mexican American agriculture, to use thermal mass, so you don't need air conditioning or heating, using solar panels to make sure that all your electricity just directly from the sun, going basically off the grid, using snow and rainwater to water your for your water needs, and not having to rely on water from rivers and lakes. That's just one example. And then we're seeing it across the country as young people are trying to adapt to find ways to reduce their footprint on America, on the Earth's environment. And I think all of those are great stories. I mean, my sons tell me, they're both in their 20s, that hey, Dad, why are you still using plastic? Use your recyclable bag instead of doing it. So, those are things that, again, little things, but add up. And just
listen to them.
Plastic in the oceans, yeah.
You should listen to your sons. I think young people are much more aware. Sarita, how about some good, positive examples that we can get feel some hope from?
Yeah, well, Jennifer, there are so many, but I'm just gonna lift up a couple. we have the extreme blessing to work with a community partner called Power 52 Foundation. They're located in Baltimore, and Power 52 provides job training in solar installation. Now, why is that such a big deal? Because Power 52 has created a workforce strategy that really hits at the heart of racism and the kind of the things that we're talking about here. One of the things that I have recognized in my work is that whether it's being able to protect yourself from being resilient to a disaster, being able to recover from a disaster, being able to live in a community with clean air and clean water so you don't get sick in the first place, the underlying issue is access to money, right? Economic disparities are, you know, I was looking at a presentation here last night on the news where they were just talking about the gap between whites and blacks economically, the median household income and, you know, jobs and home ownership. And it was like I knew it was really bad, but it was like the updated data made me sick, right? It was just, it blew me away. Oh, I'm sorry, we're supposed to be talking about good things. But anyway, so Power 52 is using their job training to actually transform lives. So many of the trainees that they're working with, they actually are recruiting from the criminal unjust system. So they've been incarcerated and they're soon to be released, or they've had other interactions with the criminal unjust system that have caused them to have a record and be hard to employ. And they've had life situations that have created chronic employment issues and hopelessness and all these things. So what Power 52 does is they bring these folks into their training program as a part of a family where we see you. We see you, we love you, we are here for you more than just to give you this book training and this on-the-job training support. And then once they're credentialed through the training program, they actually help them get jobs. I see somebody just chatted, love Power 52.
They love them, yep. Great.
They actually help them get jobs, good paying jobs in the solar industry. So this is having a quadruple bottom line effect because it's changing lives. It's helping our environment. It is reducing GHG emissions, which is going to impact, hopefully slow down climate change. We're just seeing this multitude of ways that they have, that work has impacted the communities in a very positive way. But they're in Baltimore, but they've catalyzed a movement across this nation. Power 52 built the first community-based resilience hubs in the nation. They've catalyzed community resilience hubs, and they don't get credit for it. They don't get credit for it. Why? Racism, right? Mm-hmm. That's my assessment, because if they were a white organization with a lot of capacity and resources, their work would be recognized as the catalyst around now this work that's happening across the country, which is great work. And they've been so wonderful to share their secret sauce and how they were able to get this work done, working in partnership with community-based organizations that have site control or that own their property to build these hubs. But that's one example. I could go on and on, but I know we don't have time for that. Yeah.
I know. Well, the time is flying for sure, and we've gotten so much great information. You all are getting a lot of love in the chat. Someone wants to start a LULAC chapter in Charlotte. Christian wants to do that, and then you're getting Beverly says she loves Power 52. So those are great stories and give us real hope for the future. So we only have time for a couple more quick questions, and I wanted to try to get one in try to get two in. We'll start with one. Kelly from California wants to know, because so much of our health impacts are connected to what's going on with climate. And so have you been successful in bringing some of the trusted messengers from the medical community forward in the work that you're doing? And how is that, are there people of color in the medical community? Is there a challenge, making that connection? Because we know there are healthcare disparities as well. So Domingo, I'd love to hear that.
We're having to rely a lot on our public health hospitals. I just did a webinar with a bilingual doctor at Parkland Hospital that was talking about the impacts of the secondary issues that a lot of Latinos have from diabetes, asthma, respiratory, heart disease, and then now coupled with COVID-19 and the fact that a lot of this is driven by climate change and the impact it's having in our communities and health, and getting the word out in English and Spanish to make sure that those that are most at risk, the essential workers, are getting the information they need, and also getting the consciousness they need. So when they go to the ballot box in November, they are going to be voting for candidates that are actually trying to make a difference on climate and their health.
Great. And Sarita, in your work with health professionals, I have to put in one quick plug for our program. We have a Climate for Health program at ecoAmerica. And so absolutely there are resources there for health professionals, climateforhealth.org. But Sarita, tell us about your experience.
Well, we are really grateful and excited to be in a partnership with the Kresge Foundation, where we serve as the National Program Office for their Climate, Health, and Equity Initiative. So as a part of that work, Kresge, is like, they're groundbreaking in terms of within their foundation, bringing together their environmental and their health program to create awareness around and to foster policy change around the impacts of health, individuals' health as a result of climate change. And so we've talked about some of those earlier, like Jennifer talked about the asthma, I talked about the mold, which causes the asthma. We talked about air quality issues and how those contribute to, there's cancer cluster in the 5th Ward of Houston that has just been identified, and it is directly related to toxic emissions that the people who live in that community are close to. So we know these impacts are real, and that climate change is exacerbating these impacts, if not directly causing them. And so Kresge also recognized this and actually catalyzed the Climate, Health, and Equity Initiative, where we at ISC are working to support their efforts by providing capacity building and technical assistance support to community-based organizations, public health, governments and institutions, and also health institutions, hospitals, and health systems. And so our work is really designed around understanding the relationship across climate and health and equity, right? What are the things that we need to be doing that are undergirded with equity, because all of the things that we talked about are impacting people of color far greater, and they're impacting people who have been redlined to live in communities that are close to toxic emissions, close to freeways where all the greenhouse gas emissions are being breathed in every single day. So we are starting to do that work, and actually that work is growing. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is now taking up some challenges around climate, health, and equity and making an impact there as well. And we just started working on an initiative just in the past couple of weeks with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation as well.
Well, it's so inspiring to hear that there are foundations that are funding this, that people are working on this, that there are places around the country. And Sarita, you mentioned the redlining. I just read that in Minneapolis, Denver, and Portland, they have the largest differentials in heat. The heat that the communities get to in historically red-line districts and non-red-line districts. And sometimes that heat is as much as 12 degrees of difference. And that heat impact on people's health is tremendous. And so that is absolutely something that we need to continue to educate people about and work to change.
And African
one more thing.
Americans die more often at greater rates due to heat-related illnesses than any other group. And so, you know, this just gets back to the question we got about communities and the information that they need. If you go to the Black community and you started talking about heat-related illnesses, please come to a meeting about heat-related illnesses. People are going to be like, why am I going to spend my time? My time is precious and wonderful. If you go to the community and you start talking to them about the lack, their utility bills and the lack of access to air conditioning for seniors and people who are low income, then you're speaking a language that they're like, yes, we're concerned about these issues. We'll come to the meeting. At the meeting, that's where you can go through the data that talks about heat-related illnesses, but you can't walk in the room and start talking about heat-related illnesses, right? So we have to change the way that we approach our conversation. And this is with everybody. Communities of color are no anomaly in this way. This is with everybody. If you want to get their attention, you talk to them about the things that they're concerned about, and then you connect those to the bigger issue that you may be working on that is the root cause of the issue, but they are dealing with the day-to-day impacts right now, and so we have to speak language that is important to them and that they, you know, are interested in.
Oh my goodness.
Sorry.
I could talk with the two of you forever, but my team is telling me our time is up. The hour has flown by, and it has been such an informative and interesting discussion. You know, I just feel that it is a time for great change in our community, and you have been so inspiring. I hope that everybody listening feels like they want to be part of the wave of action that is going to bring America forward so that we can truly live up to our whole ethos of liberty and justice for all. So thank you so much. You've got lots of love in the chat, and our Let's Talk Climate series is going to continue on our YouTube channel next Thursday, June 8th. You'll be able to view a pre-recorded episode called Environmental Racism, Climate Justice, and Health. And you can be sure to join us live 2 weeks from today on June 25th for Doing Justice, the Role of Faith in Building Climate Equity, and that's going to be at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. So you can engage with us online with the hashtag Let's Talk Climate, and be sure to subscribe and follow us for the latest thought leadership resources and episodes on climate action and climate advocacy. So I want to say a big thank you again to our amazing speakers. You were so engaging. I almost went over time, and we hope to continue this conversation for sure with your organizations and beyond. And I want to thank the ecoAmerica staff who's been helping today. And I want to say that we believe Black lives matter.
Amen.
Stay well, stay safe. See you on the 25th.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, Jennifer.